Hello everyone and welcome back. We're barely 2 months into the new year and already we've seen free expression advocates massacred in Paris. We've seen a Jewish market attacked because of its Jewishness. There was the Japanese journalist beheaded by ISIS, the Jordanian pilot burned alive. More recently, there were the 2 shootings in Denmark, one aimed at critics of Islam, and the other aimed, once again, at Jews. It's getting so dangerous for Jews in Europe that the Prime Minister of Israel has urged them to leave the continent before it's too late. And Jews aren't the only ones being persecuted for their faith. Last week, 21 Coptic Christians were beheaded in Libya. And this week, ISIS fanatics kidnapped another 90 Christians in Syria. What a world! And as difficult as it is to stomach these atrocities, the Bible says it's just the tip of the iceberg. We're fast approaching a world in which the most dangerous regime is about to acquire the most dangerous weapon. Over the last couple of weeks, we have seen a few more members in the mainstream media, the Western media, sound the alarm about what's happening in the Middle East, particularly with ISIS. I mean, it's hard not to take notice of it when you see these graphic videos being circulated. But there was a report on February the 13th filed by Richard Engel of NBC, which that network leans pretty far to the left. But it exposed just this horrific practice of the sex slaves, these ISIS groups going into communities, killing off the men, the Yazidis, and then selling the women into captivity to be sex slaves for these terrorists, these barbarians. And the interview, or the report that was filed, interviewed 2 teenage girls that had escaped this and live to tell their story, just basically being passed around from one terrorist house to the next. The reporter, Richard Engel, said that this is evil, and he commented on how that's not a word that they typically use in journalism. But this is evil. And the host of the program that night also talked about this barbaric tradition that ISIS is very proud of. They feel like the Quran backs them up on this. And so they're proud to reinstitute this. It was a graphic report, and there should be more like them. On MSNBC, the sister network, this is what Chris Matthews said on February 13th. It says, "These 21 beheadings of Coptic Christians is an ancient horror that's been carried out before our eyes, purposely so. Why else is the indecency so well videotaped, so well produced to hit every screen in our state of the art possession? They're using the death of people to demonstrate their devotion, their ruthlessness, their power." He went on to say in that broadcast that we in the West, we in America, that we're being morally humiliated by these terrorist groups. There was another article that got quite a lot of publicity last week too from The Atlantic. Here again, it's a left-leaning publication, but the title of the article, as you can see there, is "What ISIS Really Wants" by Graham Wood, and the basic gist of the article is that this is motivated by Islam. This is a religious movement. And you keep hearing members in the Obama administration talking about how it's not a religious movement, that these are just terrorists, that there's nothing religious about it. But this article, 30 or 40 pages in The Atlantic, really does expose the ideology behind the movement He says the Islamic State is no mere collection of psychopaths. It's a religious group with carefully considered beliefs among them that it is a key agent of the coming apocalypse. I mean, they believe that they're bringing about prophecies. They believe they're fulfilling prophecies. These radical Islamists, later in the article, it says the reality is that the Islamic State is Islamic, very Islamic. Yes, it has attracted psychopaths and adventure seekers, drawn largely from the disaffected populations of the Middle East and Europe, but the religion preached by its most ardent followers derives from coherent and even learned interpretations of Islam. Where are they getting their beliefs? What's driving them? That's what he's talking about here. Virtually every major decision and law promulgated by the Islamic State adheres to what it calls in its press and pronouncements and on its billboards, license plates, stationery, and coins, the prophetic methodology, which means following the prophecy and example of Muhammad in punctilious detail. Now, all of these groups have, different variations as far as their belief system goes, but they're following in punctilious detail, as he says there, carrying on. Muslims can reject the Islamic State, nearly all do, but pretending that it isn't actually a religious millenarian group with theology that must be understood to be combated has already led the United States to underestimate it and back foolish schemes to counter it. See, it's because we turn a blind eye to the religious component to this movement that we've underestimated it. Now, as I say, it's nice to finally see some commentators, even those on the left, who are beginning to realize that this is a religious war, that this is very Islamic, as he brings out in that Atlantic piece. And even some in the West pointing out how the United States has badly misjudged groups like ISIS. But the thing is, as I alluded to at the top, the thing is, what all commentators have yet to acknowledge is that the United States is making the exact same mistake with the mullahs in Tehran. They're motivated by a lot of the same kind of radical extremist theology, as you'll see here in just a second. And what takes this to a level that's so much more dangerous than what we're seeing play out in Libya, in Iraq, in Syria, is that this regime is on the brink of obtaining a nuclear bomb, a nuclear weapon. You can misjudge a small army, 30,000 maybe, 40,000, whatever the numbers for ISIS is, but you can misjudge a group like that when they're running around Syria or Libya or wherever in Toyotas, brandishing machine guns and waving knives and so on. But what happens when you make a mistake with a regime that wants to obtain a nuclear weapon and has said over and over again that America's the great Satan, Israel's the little Satan, they want to blow Israel off the map, they want to kill all the Jews, and they're driven by a radical theology. It's Islamic. It's very Islamic. President Obama received quite a lot of flack last year for calling ISIS the JV team and just kind of brushing them aside like they weren't really that big of a problem. And then we've seen it explode onto our screens and in headlines over the past year. He was saying ISIS is JV and Al-Qaeda is, I guess, the varsity team that we're playing against in this basketball game. But really, when you look at ISIS, when you look at Al-Qaeda together with ISIS, compared to Iran, the number one state sponsor of terrorism, they are JV. And Iran is the varsity. But the problem is, at least with respect to America's foreign policy, is that the White House sees Iran as playing on our team. They're on the same team. And Al-Qaeda is the main enemy and ISIS is the JV. It just highlights just how dangerous this world is becoming and how upside down it is in the United States. This article, it's just a draft that I read through this week, the man behind Iran's terrifying success. It's coming out in the next Trumpet magazine, April 2015. If you don't subscribe, make sure that you go to thetrumpet.com and become a subscriber and see this alliance that really is there between the White House and between the mullahs. I mean, they're desperate in the White House to form an agreement with this radical group of leaders. If you go back just to 2012, just a few years ago, when the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, said in July of 2012, he talked in a long speech about the end of times and how that we, in the faith, we need to be aware of these prophecies. He talked about the imminent return of the Mahdi, or the 12th Imam, as you've probably heard in a few sources at least. Not nearly enough, but a few voices have talked about the Islamic theology of so many of these Shiite movements. To quote from the supreme leader, this is the leader of Iran, mind you, and in 2012, he says, the issue of Imam Mahdi is of utmost importance, and his reappearance has been clearly stated in our holy religion of Islam. It's talked about in our religion, he says, our holy religion. He says we must study and remind ourselves of the end of times and Imam Mahdi's era. We must prepare the environment for the coming so that the great leader will come. This is a belief, again. It's steeped in the prophecies of Islam, those anticipating the arrival of the Mahdi, the 12th Imam. And according to this theology, the Mahdi's return is going to be precipitated by planet-engulfing wars, worldwide war, that's going to destroy a third of the earth's inhabitants. And that's going to be joined together with widespread hunger and disease, social unrest. And the thing about it is, if you have studied, again, most in the West just kind of brush these things aside. Oh, it's not really religious. They're really good people. We can work out a deal. But if you actually look into the theology, as this man at the Atlantic did with respect to ISIS, it's frightening. It's frightening. They believe that they have a responsibility to hasten these prophecies, to actually create the apocalyptic conditions that will hasten the return of the Mahdi. That's what ISIS believes, but as I say, on a much smaller scale. You look at Iran today and what they're about to obtain, and think of them as ISIS with nuclear weapons. Think of them as ISIS, except with a military force many times larger, and then with the weapons of mass destruction. It's a frightening scenario. This is from Now, the website, a Lebanese website. The article title, Eyeless on Tehran. It says, the reality is that during the last decade, Iran has been actively pushing for fragmentation of the Arab world. What's the rationale? Quite simply, that an Arab world deeply divided, shattered into sectarian entities, and weakened represents fertile ground for Iran to impose its hegemony regionally. I mean, in so many of these areas, whether it's Sunni or Shia, I mean, it works to Iran's advantage. When there's all of this division, everything's fractious, there's these differing movements, differing ideologies. You know, the religion's a little bit different all across the board. But it serves Iran's purpose, this chaos, because it really puts them up in a position of strength. Carrying on, he says, the Iranians are more than willing to allow the United States and the Arab states to bombard ISIS, as the group represents an irritant in that it straddles vital Iranian supply lines between Iraq and Syria, but ISIS hardly represents a strategic threat to Iran. That's the reality. As brutal as these videos are, they do not represent a strategic threat to Iran. It says, on the contrary, by drawing Western attention to the terrorist problem, it distracts Western governments from Iran's larger project in the Middle East. That larger project is regional dominance and the acquisition of a nuclear weapon. Look at how distracted the world is. They may be waking up, some in the Western media, they may be waking up to the theology that motivates ISIS, but when will they wake up to the theology that motivates Iran, the mullahs? Forget the president, whether he's moderate or extreme or anything in between. The supreme leader and the mullahs run the country. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been trying to sound the alarm, and in recent weeks, of course, you've probably heard about the controversy over him speaking before the Congress of the United States on March the 3rd. And the White House is furious that he would, as they think, try to win some political points with upcoming elections in Israel by speaking at Congress. But now, as the details are starting to emerge, the details of this deal that the United States wants so desperately to make with Iran over its nuclear weapons program, those details, by the way, started to emerge just this week. Here's what David Horowitz said at the Times of Israel. Among the terms of the deal being reported by the Associated Press from Geneva on Monday are precisely those that were asserted in recent weeks by the Israeli sources, precisely those that were scoffed at by the administration. See, when Israel started to sound the alarm a few weeks back, the White House, the representatives of the White House says that they were misrepresenting the facts. They didn't know the facts. They didn't know the deal. And the White House all along has been trying to finish this deal under a veil of secrecy. They don't want those facts revealed. Now they're starting to come out. And these are some of the facts of the deal. Centrally, Iran is to be allowed to keep 6,500 centrifuges spinning, and there will be a sunset clause providing for an end to intrusive inspections in some 10 or 15 years. Well, yes, as part of the deal, we'll stop the inspections down the road in good faith. If anything, indeed, some of the terms reported by the AP are even more worrying than those that were leaked in Jerusalem. It says the idea would be to reward Iran for good behavior over the last years of any agreement, the AP said, gradually lifting constraints on its uranium enrichment program and slowly easing economic sanctions. There's also no indication of restrictions on Iran's missile development, its potential delivery systems. So they can carry on business as usual, and we'll just take their word for it that they don't really want to develop this technology for the sake of producing weapons. It's all for energy or whatever it might be. Here again, though, if you look at the religion behind the movement and what they have said over and over again, what they intend to do with the weapons once created, you can see why Israel's prime minister is so adamant, why he insists on speaking before Congress. Here's some excerpts from a speech he gave just a couple of weeks ago. It's quite a long quote, but he gave this speech, I believe, in Israel, and it was reported in one of the papers, or the transcript ran in one of the papers in New York. He said in this speech, February 16th, "Why am I going to Washington? Because as Prime Minister of Israel, it's my obligation to do everything in my power to prevent the conclusion of a bad deal that could threaten the survival of the state of Israel. He wants to go before the deal is made so that he can hopefully prevent it from going forward. He has Israel's interests at heart here. He says the current proposal to Iran would endanger Israel. It would enable Iran to build its first nuclear device within an unacceptably short time. And it would allow Iran to build an industrial capability to enrich uranium that could provide the fuel for many bombs in the coming years. A regime that, notice this, a regime that openly calls for Israel's destruction would thus have finally the means to realize its genocidal aims. I think the real question is, how could any responsible Israeli prime minister refuse to speak to Congress on a matter so important to Israel's survival? I mean, how can I not speak? How can I not sound the alarm? That's what Netanyahu is saying. Why go now? The deadline for reaching an agreement with Iran is March 24th. That date drives the speech. Now is the time before Israel. Now is the time for Israel to make its case before it's too late. See, the White House criticizes him and is calling it a political ploy, but he's saying, look, the deal for the agreement, that's supposed to happen March 24th. I'm speaking on March the 3rd in hopes that it might wake some people up, in hopes that we can get a better deal. He says a little later, would it be better to complain about a deal that threatens the security of Israel after it's signed? It's more responsible to speak out now, to try to influence the negotiations while they're still ongoing. The pursuit of nuclear weapons by Iran is the most urgent security challenge facing the world. The greatest danger facing humanity is the possibility that any movement or any regime of militant Islam will arm itself with weapons of mass destruction. That's what we're facing here. It's a movement of militant Islam, not unlike ISIS. I mean, there's differences. There's differences between Sunni and Shia. There's differences religiously from sect to sect. But this is militant Islam through and through. And they're about to get weapons of mass destruction. He says everything that we see in our region, talking about ISIS, Al-Qaeda, everything we see in our region now will pale by comparison. I mean, they are JV, those other groups, compared to Iran. Everything that we see in Europe will pale by comparison. When a militant Islamic regime that is rampaging through the region right now, that's what Iran is doing. It's conducting a rampage through the region. When such a regime has nuclear weapons, the whole world will be in peril. It's becoming a more dangerous world by far. This is the world we're about to head into. He says, look, this is the final quote, look at what Iran is doing now. Without nuclear weapons, states are collapsing and Iran is plunging forward. It already controls 4 capitals, already. And it's working, some would say, behind the scenes, while the world is very distracted with what's happening in Syria, in Iraq, in Libya. And here is Iran, behind a lot of the chaos, in control now of 4 world capitals. And yet, if Prime Minister Netanyahu wants to sound the alarm, he's ridiculed. He's criticized as an opportunist. It's an upside-down world. President Obama's administration had a violent extremism summit just a week ago, where one of the guests at that summit was a man by the name of Salam al-Marayati, an Islamic radical, really, who wanted to blame the Jews for 9/11 and has apologized for nothing, really, in the world of radical Islamic terrorism. He was there in the White House, and yet, if you look at the statements coming out of the White House, I mean, you'd think Prime Minister Netanyahu was the biggest problem that the United States is facing. What a dangerous world that we're heading in. Let's just look at Daniel 11 here as we conclude this program. Daniel chapter 11, this is a verse I know that we've read many times, and while you get your Bible and read along with me, let me just remind you, too, of what my father said a couple of weeks ago in his Key of David broadcast about Yemen, the crisis in Yemen, Iran basically taking over another nation, and so strategically significant. If you look on a map, you can see why. You can see why nations like Saudi Arabia are very nervous as Iran expands its power and its influence, controlling, as the Prime Minister said, 4 world capitals in Lebanon, Syria, now Yemen, Iraq, you could say too. What influence? It's all building, isn't it, to a spectacular clash. This is Daniel 11 and verse 40. It says, "And at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships, and he shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over." This king of the south is the Iranian-led radical Islamic movement. And certainly with some of these smaller offshoots here and there, you can see some pushing being done. But when push comes to shove, and when the king of the north, the European superpower, finally does respond and take care of the problem, they're going to go right to the head of the snake, which is Iran. They're going to come against it in this spectacular show of force. Another crusade. Another crusade. We're seeing the beginning stages of it already. And through it all, God's warning to you and to me is to stay grounded and settled in the hope of the gospel. Let's just look at one more verse in Revelation 12. To stay grounded in the hope of the gospel. A few weeks ago, I gave a program on the last days, going through 2 Timothy 3 and verse 1, and just how perilous or dangerous the times would be here in the days leading right up to the return of Jesus Christ. And these are the days that John warns about here in Revelation 12 and verse 12. It says, "Therefore rejoice, you heavens, and you that dwell in them. Woe unto the inhabitants of the earth and of the sea, for the devil is come down unto you, having great wrath, because he knows that he has but a short time." Satan is on the loose. He's been cast down. He's confined to this earth, and he is the father of lies and destruction and murder. And we see that spreading over all the earth. We see it spreading all around us. He's going about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. And so stay strong, stay close to God. Keep your eyes open, like Jesus told us to. Watch, he said. Watch and pray always. Anticipate that soon coming arrival of Jesus Christ, his second coming. That's all we have time for today, and we'll see you again next time.